In the heart of Chicago, a city known for its towering skyscrapers and bustling streets, life wasn't always as glamorous as it seemed. Beneath the shiny surface lay a darker reality. Crime was rampant, and trust in law enforcement had started to crumble. For years, whispers of corruption within the police department had been growing louder, but no one could pin anything on them. That's where our story begins. On the corner of a busy street near the courthouse, an old woman sat hunched over, her face hidden beneath layers of dirt and grime. Her clothes were torn, patched together with whatever she could find. People walked past her without giving her a second glance. She blended into the background like just another faceless figure in the crowd. But there was something about this woman that no one noticed, something extraordinary. What these passers-by didn't know was that this homeless woman wasn't who she appeared to be. Her name, or rather her real identity, was Agent Carter, one of the FBI's top undercover operatives. For months she had been living on the streets, immersing herself in a world most people tried desperately to avoid. It was all part of a carefully planned mission to expose some of the dirtiest secrets hiding inside the police force. Agent Carter wasn't new to dangerous missions. Over the years, she had worked on countless cases, often going deep undercover, to gather evidence against criminals. But this assignment was different. This time, she wasn't just targeting ordinary bad guys. She was taking on corrupt cops, men and women sworn to protect the public but secretly using their badges for personal gain. They were involved in everything from drug trafficking to money laundering, and they thought they were untouchable. To pull off her disguise, Agent Carter had transformed herself completely. Gone were her neatly pressed suits and polished shoes. Instead, she wore clothes that smelled of damp alleys and slept in abandoned buildings. She learned how to beg convincingly, how to blend in with others struggling to survive on the margins of society. Every detail mattered because even the slightest slip-up could blow her cover. Every day she listened closely to conversations around her, picking up bits and pieces of information. Some nights she'd sit silently in dimly lit shelters watching officers come and go, noticing patterns others might miss. Other times she'd strike up casual chats with informants, people who knew more than they let on but needed nudging to talk. Slowly but surely, she pieced together a web of corruption so intricate it made her stomach churn. But despite her best efforts, things weren't moving fast enough. The higher-ups at the FBI were growing impatient. They wanted results, tangible, proof that could bring down the entire operation. So, Agent Carter decided to take a bold step, a risky move that would either make or break her mission. One chilly morning, she positioned herself outside the courthouse, right where police officers often conducted sweeps to clear out vagrants. Sure enough, it wasn't long before a patrol car pulled up, and two uniformed officers stepped out. Without hesitation, they approached her, asking her to move along. When she didn't comply quickly enough, they cuffed her and shoved her into the back seat of their car. As the vehicle sped toward the station, Agent Carter allowed herself a small smile. This arrest was exactly what she needed. It was the perfect opportunity to get closer to the people she was investigating, to see them in their element and catch them off guard. Little did they know, they had just walked straight into her trap, to the precinct. The officers processed her like any other vagrant offender. To them, she was just another nuisance, someone unworthy of attention. They laughed among themselves, making jokes about her ragged appearance and mumbling complaints about having to deal with people like her. None of them suspected that beneath the dirt and tattered clothes lay a sharp mind and a fierce determination to bring them to justice. When Agent Carter finally appeared in court later that day, charged with loitering, the atmosphere was tense, yet dismissive. The judge barely glanced at her file before calling the case forward. Officers lounged casually in the back of the courtroom, exchanging smirks and snide remarks. No one paid much attention to the frail-looking woman sitting quietly at the defendant's table, and that's when everything changed, but not in the way anyone expected. What happened next would leave the entire courtroom stunned and turn Agent Carter's seemingly insignificant arrest into the beginning of something monumental. The courtroom was alive with murmurs and side conversations. the kind of low hum you'd expect in a place where people didn't really care about what was happening. The judge sat at the front, flipping through papers with an air of indifference, while the officers in the room leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, looking like they were waiting for something mildly entertaining to happen. And then there was her, the woman everyone thought was just another faceless vagrant. She sat slouched in her chair, clutching a worn-out blanket that smelled faintly of dampness and dirt. Her hair was messy, matted almost, and her clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. To anyone watching, she seemed broken, defeated, like someone who had given up on life long ago. But if you looked closely, really closely, you might have noticed the sharp glint in her eyes. Hidden beneath layers of grime and exhaustion, it was the kind of look that said she was aware of everything going on around her, even if no one else realized it. One of the officers leaned over to his partner and whispered something under his breath. Both men chuckled quietly, shaking their heads. "Another waste of time," one of them muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few others joined in, nodding in agreement. No one took her seriously. Why would they? She was just a homeless woman after all. Or so they thought. When the judge finally called her case, the bailiff led her to the stand. She shuffled forward slowly, dragging her feet as though every step required tremendous effort. Her voice was barely audible when she tried to answer the questions posed to her. At one point, she mumbled something unintelligible, causing a ripple of laughter to spread through the room. Even the prosecutor sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes as if he couldn't believe he was wasting his time on such a trivial matter. But here's the thing. None of this fazed her. Not the mocking laughter, not the dismissive glances, not the way people acted like she wasn't even human. If anything, it only fueled her resolve. Inside, she was calm, focused, and calculating. Every insult, every snicker, every eye roll, they all served a purpose. They confirmed what she already knew. These officers felt untouchable, invincible, and that arrogance would be their downfall. As the proceedings dragged on, she kept her head down, letting her greasy hair fall over her face like a curtain. But behind that curtain, her mind was working overtime. She observed everything, the way certain officers exchanged knowing looks, the subtle nods they gave each other when certain topics came up, the way some shifted uncomfortably in their seats whenever the judge mentioned evidence or documentation. These were tiny details, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but to her they were gold. At one point, the judge asked if she had anything to say in her defense. She hesitated, staying in character, then shook her head slowly. "No, Your Honor," she rasped, her voice cracking slightly. The words were barely audible, but they carried just enough weight to make the judge sigh and scribble something on his notepad. He was clearly eager to wrap things up and move on to more important cases. Meanwhile, the officers continued their antics. One of them leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head like he was bored out of his mind. Another pulled out his phone, scrolling absent-mindedly as though he had better things to do. None of them paid her any real attention. To them, she was invisible, a nobody unworthy of their time or respect. And yet, despite their mockery, there was something unsettling about her presence. Maybe it was the way she held herself, even in her hunched-over posture. Or maybe it was the fact that she never once reacted to their jabs or insults. Whatever it was, it left a lingering feeling in the air, a sense that something wasn't quite right, but no one could put their finger on it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge announced his decision. "Case dismissed," he said curtly, waving his hand as though shooing away an annoying fly. The officers perked up immediately, some of them standing to leave, eager to get out of the courtroom and back to their usual routines. But before anyone could move, the woman stood up. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened her posture, shedding the slouch that had defined her for months. For the first time, she looked directly at the crowd, her eyes locking onto theirs with an intensity that sent chills down their spines. Then, without saying a word, she reached into the folds of her tattered clothing and pulled out a small, shiny object. It took a moment for everyone to realize what it was. A badge, An FBI badge. The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. People froze in place, their mouths agape as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The woman they had laughed at, mocked, and dismissed as insignificant was not who they thought she was. She wasn't a vagrant or a nuisance. She was an undercover agent, and she had been playing them all along. For a brief second, sheer panic flashed across the faces of the officers. Some of them instinctively reached for their belts as though expecting to find handcuffs there. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances, silently asking each other how this had happened. How had they missed it? How had they failed to see through her disguise? Before anyone could react, she spoke. Her voice was steady, clear, and commanding, nothing like the raspy whispers they had heard earlier. "I am Special Agent Carter of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she declared, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "And today, you will learn the consequences of your actions." With that, she produced a flash drive from her pocket and handed it to the judge. "This contains evidence of systemic corruption within your department," she explained, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces in the room. "Illegal activities, including drug trafficking and bribery, have been facilitated by multiple officers. Today, justice will begin." The silence that followed was deafening. Officers exchanged panicked looks, whispering frantically to each other as the weight of her words sank in. Some tried to laugh it off, pretending it was some kind of elaborate prank, but the fear in their eyes betrayed them. They knew they were caught. Agent Carter, now standing tall and confident, watched as federal agents entered the courtroom, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. One by one, they began, rounding up the officers implicated in her investigation. The same men who had laughed at her mere moments ago were now being led away in handcuffs, their arrogance replaced by shock and shame. As the chaos unfolded around her, Agent Carter remained composed. She had spent months living in squalor, enduring ridicule and humiliation, all for this moment. And now, as the truth came to light, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Justice, she thought, was a beautiful thing. The courtroom was in complete disarray. Federal agents moved swiftly, their presence commanding and authoritative, as they began rounding up the officers implicated in Agent Carter's investigation. The same men who had laughed at her just moments ago now found themselves being handcuffed, their faces pale with shock. Some tried to protest, stammering excuses or claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but their words fell on deaf ears. Others simply stood there, frozen, unable to process how quickly their world had unraveled. Agent Carter stood quietly in the middle of the chaos, watching as everything unfolded. Her disguise was gone now. She no longer slouched or hid behind her tattered clothes. Instead, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew she had done her job well. There was no gloating, no smugness in her expression, just a quiet satisfaction that justice was finally being served. But even as the officers were led away, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. And yet seeing the fear and humiliation on their faces reminded her of the toll corruption took, not just on the public, but on those who allowed themselves to be consumed by it. As the initial wave of arrests subsided, the room began to clear out. The judge, still processing the bombshell revelation, thanked Agent Carter for her service and assured her that the evidence would be thoroughly reviewed. She nodded respectfully, knowing this was only the beginning. What happened next would determine whether the system could truly be fixed or if it was too far gone. Back at FBI headquarters, the mood was electric. News of Agent Carter's success spread like wildfire, with colleagues gathering around to congratulate her. Some patted her on the back, others shook her hand, and a few even hugged her, overwhelmed by what she had accomplished. For months she had been living a double life, sacrificing her comfort and dignity to bring down one of the most entrenched networks of corruption the city had ever seen. Now, standing in the familiar surroundings of the office, surrounded by people who understood the gravity of her mission, she finally allowed herself to breathe. But the celebration was short-lived. As the hours passed, the enormity of what she had uncovered began to sink in. The files on the flash drive contained more than just audio recordings and surveillance footage. They revealed a web of deceit so vast and intricate that it made even seasoned investigators shudder. Officers weren't just turning a blind eye to illegal activities. They were actively participating in them, using their positions of power to line their pockets and protect their criminal associates. Drug deals, money laundering, bribery, it was all there, documented meticulously by Agent Carter during her time undercover. What struck everyone the most was the sheer audacity of it. These officers had believed they were untouchable, shielded by their badges and the assumption that no one would dare question them. They had underestimated Agent Carter, dismissing her as harmless because of her appearance and status. But their arrogance had blinded them to the truth, that justice doesn't care about appearances. It sees through facades, cuts through lies, and holds people accountable regardless of who they are, or who they think they are. Over the next few days, the story dominated headlines across the country. Journalists scrambled to piece together the details, while citizens expressed a mix of outrage and relief. Many had suspected corruption within the police department for years but lacked proof. Now, thanks to Agent Carter's bravery and determination, the truth was out in the open. Public forums erupted with debates about accountability and reform, with some calling for immediate changes to restore trust in law enforcement, while others demanded harsher punishments for those involved. For Agent Carter, the attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside her apartment, desperate for an interview. Social media exploded with memes and hashtags praising her courage. Strangers stopped her on the street to thank her, tears streaming down their faces as they recounted stories of loved ones who had suffered at the hands of corrupt cops. It was heartwarming, yes, but also exhausting. She hadn't done this for fame or recognition. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. Yet she understood that her actions had sparked something bigger, a movement toward transparency and accountability. Behind closed doors, however, things weren't as celebratory. The fallout from the investigation was immense. Dozens of officers were suspended pending further review, while several high-ranking officials resigned in disgrace. Families were torn apart as spouses and children grappled with the reality of what their loved ones had done. Some defended them, insisting they must have been coerced or threatened, while others cut ties altogether, unwilling to associate with criminals. Amidst the turmoil, Agent Carter found herself reflecting on her own journey. Living on the streets had been harder than she anticipated, not physically, though that was challenging enough, but emotionally. Every day she had faced rejection, ridicule, and indifference. People had spat at her, yelled at her, and treated her like she didn't exist. At times it felt like the weight of the world was crushing her, and she wondered if she was strong enough to see the mission through. But she had pushed forward, driven by a sense of purpose that refused to let her quit. Now, as she sat in her office late at night going over the case files one last time, she realized how much the experience had changed her. She had always been passionate about justice, but this assignment had deepened her understanding of inequality and prejudice. It had shown her firsthand how society often judged people based on superficial traits, how easy it was to dismiss someone simply because of how they looked or where they came from, and it had reinforced her belief that true change required empathy, patience, and unwavering resolve. Her thoughts drifted to the future. The investigation was far from over. There were still loose ends to tie up and new leads to follow. But beyond that, she hoped her work would inspire others to speak out against injustice, no matter how daunting it seemed. If a single woman posing as a homeless vagrant could expose a network of corruption, then anyone could make a difference, if they were willing to try. As dawn broke over the city, casting golden light onto the skyline, Agent Carter stepped outside for some fresh air. The streets were waking up, filled with the sounds of honking cars, chattering pedestrians, and bustling vendors. Life went on, as it always did, but something felt different. Maybe it was the knowledge that for once the bad guys hadn't won, or maybe it was the hope that somewhere out there someone else was preparing to fight their own battle, for truth, for fairness, for a better tomorrow. And with that thought, Agent Carter smiled. Her mission may have ended, but the ripple effects of her courage were only beginning to unfold. The weeks following the courtroom revelation were a whirlwind of activity. The city was buzzing with news of the corruption scandal, and everywhere you looked, people were talking about it. From coffee shops to bus stops, conversations revolved around the undercover agent who had fooled everyone, the woman no one saw coming. For Agent Carter, though, the aftermath wasn't just about the headlines or the public reaction. It was about dealing with the emotional toll of what she had endured and figuring out how to move forward. The trial against the corrupt officers moved quickly, thanks to the mountain of evidence Agent Carter had gathered during her time undercover. Every recording, every document, every photograph told a story, a damning narrative that left little room for doubt. In court, she took the stand multiple times, recounting her experiences in vivid detail. She described the nights spent sleeping on cold concrete, the days pretending to beg for spare change, and the countless interactions where she had to bite her tongue while being mocked and belittled. Her testimony was raw and honest, painting a picture of resilience that resonated deeply with those listening. One particularly powerful moment came when she explained why she had chosen to go undercover as a homeless woman. "I wanted to understand," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I wanted to see the system not from the outside, but from the perspective of someone it often ignores. If I could blend into that world, I thought, maybe I could uncover the truth and show people that assumptions can be dangerous." The courtroom fell silent as her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Even the defense attorneys, known for their sharp tactics, seemed momentarily speechless. As the trial progressed, more shocking details emerged. Informants came forward, corroborating Agent Carter's claims and adding new layers to the case. Some revealed how they had been coerced into cooperating with the corrupt officers, threatened with violence if they refused. Others spoke about the fear that had gripped their communities, knowing that the very people meant to protect them were actually exploiting them. These testimonies painted a grim picture of a system gone horribly wrong, one where trust had been shattered and lives had been ruined. For the officers involved, the verdict was devastating. One by one, they were found guilty on multiple counts, ranging from drug trafficking to bribery. Sentences varied, but none escaped punishment. Some were sentenced to decades behind bars, while others faced hefty fines and permanent bans from law enforcement. Watching them led away in handcuffs was surreal for Agent Carter. Part of her felt a sense of closure, knowing that justice had been served. But another part of her couldn't help but feel sadness, for the wasted potential, for the lives destroyed, and for the damage done to public trust. Outside the courtroom, the impact of the scandal rippled through the city. Public outrage led to calls for reform within the police department. Community leaders organized rallies demanding transparency and accountability. Politicians promised sweeping changes, including stricter oversight measures and mandatory ethics training for all officers. While some cynics dismissed these promises as empty rhetoric, others remained hopeful that real progress could be made. After all, this scandal had exposed cracks in the system, but it had also shown that those cracks could be fixed if enough people cared enough to try. For Agent Carter, adjusting to life after the mission was harder than she expected. Physically, she was fine. Months of living on the streets had toughened her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Emotionally, however, she struggled. The constant stress of maintaining her cover, the humiliation of being treated like dirt, and the weight of carrying such a huge secret had taken its toll. At night, she often lay awake, replaying moments from her time undercover. Sometimes she dreamed of standing in front of a crowd, exposing the truth, but instead of applause, she heard laughter, mocking her efforts. Other times, she relived. The sting of insults hurled her way, feeling once again like an invisible nobody. To cope, she leaned on her support system, friends, family, and colleagues who understood what she had been through. Therapy sessions became a regular part of her routine, helping her process the trauma and find ways to heal. Slowly but surely, she began to rebuild herself, piece by piece. She reminded herself that she wasn't alone, that there were people who believed in her and stood by her side. And she clung to the knowledge that her work had made a difference, not just for the victims of corruption, but for future generations who deserved a fairer, more just society. Despite the challenges, Agent Carter didn't shy away from using her platform to advocate for change. She attended community events, speaking passionately about the importance of empathy and understanding. "We live in a world where we're quick to judge," she told one audience. "We look at someone's appearance, their circumstances, and we make assumptions about who they are. But those assumptions can blind us to the truth. They can prevent us from seeing the humanity in others, and that's dangerous." Her speeches struck a chord with many, especially marginalized groups who had long felt ignored or dismissed. People approached her after events, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. Some thanked her for giving them hope. Others simply wanted to express solidarity. Each interaction reminded her why she had chosen this path in the first place: to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Over time, Agent Carter began to find peace. She knew the scars of her undercover mission would never fully fade, but she accepted them as part of her journey. They were reminders of her strength, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to justice. And they fueled her determination to keep pushing forward even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. One evening, as she walked along the riverfront, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she reflected on everything that had happened. The laughter, the mockery, the arrests. It all felt like a lifetime ago. Yet it had shaped her in ways she never imagined. She thought about the people whose lives had been touched by her work, directly or indirectly. She thought about the lessons she had learned about humanity, about resilience, about the power of believing in something bigger than yourself. And as the city lights flickered to life around her, casting reflections on the water, she smiled softly. The battle wasn't over. There would always be fights to fight, injustices to address, and voices to amplify. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. She had done what she set out to do. She had proven that even the most invisible among us could shine a light in the darkest corners, and she had shown the world that justice, though sometimes slow, was worth fighting for. Months had passed since the trial ended, and the city was still reeling from the fallout. The scandal had left an indelible mark on its people, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems they relied on every day. For Agent Carter, life had settled into a new rhythm, though it was far from ordinary. The weight of her mission lingered in subtle ways: how she carried herself, how she interacted with strangers, even how she processed the world around her. She knew that while justice had been served, the real work was only beginning. One crisp, autumn morning, Agent Carter found herself standing at the podium of a community center packed with people. It wasn't a glamorous venue, just a modest room with folding chairs and a flickering fluorescent light. But the energy in the space was electric. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the seats, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity, hope, and determination. Some clutched notepads, ready to jot down every word she said. Others leaned forward, hanging on to her presence as if she held the answers to questions they'd been asking for years. She took a deep breath before speaking, letting the silence stretch just long enough to command attention. "Prejudice blinds us," she began, her voice steady but warm. "It makes us see what we expect to see, not what's really there. When I walked those streets, covered in dirt and wearing tattered clothes, no one saw me as anything more than a homeless woman. Not because they were bad people, but because it was easier to look away than to ask why." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with the audience. A young man in the front row nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in thought. An older woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, clearly moved by the story behind the speaker. Agent Carter paused, scanning the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. She wanted them to feel seen, heard, and understood, because that's what she had fought so hard to achieve during her undercover mission. "When we judge someone based on their appearance or circumstances," she continued, "we miss the chance to connect with them as human beings. We miss their stories, their struggles, their potential. And when we do that, we create divides. Between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, us and them. Those divides don't just hurt individuals, they weaken entire communities." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding vigorously. Someone near the back raised their hand tentatively, and Agent Carter gestured for them to speak. But, how do we fix it? The person asked, their voice tinged with frustration. How do we change something so big when it feels like the system is stacked against us? It was a question she had heard countless times before, and one she didn't take lightly. She stepped away from the podium, walking closer to the audience so they could see her face clearly. Change starts small, she replied. It starts with each of us deciding to listen instead of assuming, to help instead of turning away, to stand up instead of staying silent. You don't have to tackle the whole system at once. Start where you are, with your family, your friends, your neighbors. Build trust. Speak out when you see injustice. Hold people accountable, not just others, but yourself too. Her response drew applause, soft at first, then growing louder as more people joined in. For Agent Carter, this moment was about more than delivering a speech. It was about planting seeds of hope, encouraging people to believe that they had the power to make a difference. She knew firsthand how daunting it felt to face overwhelming odds, but she also knew that even the smallest actions could spark meaningful change. After the event, dozens of attendees lined up to thank her personally. One elderly man clasped her hand tightly, tears streaming down his cheeks. "You reminded me of my daughter," he said, his voice trembling. "She disappeared years ago, and I always wondered if anyone cared enough to look for her. Hearing your story gives me hope that maybe someone did." Another woman handed her a handwritten note, thanking her for inspiring her to volunteer at a local shelter. "I've been wanting to do something for a long time," the woman admitted, "but I didn't think I could make a difference. Now, I know I can." These interactions reinforced why Agent Carter had chosen this path. Her mission hadn't just exposed corruption, it had ignited a flame of possibility in people who had long felt powerless. Each handshake, each hug, each heartfelt thank you reminded her that her efforts had ripple effects far beyond what she could measure. Back at home, however, the personal challenges remained. Living undercover had changed her in profound ways, some of which she was still grappling with. Nights were often restless, filled with vivid dreams that blurred the line between reality and memory. During the day, certain sights or sounds, a police siren, the smell of damp alleyways, triggered flashbacks to her time on the streets. Therapy helped, but healing wasn't linear. Some days felt lighter than others, while others dragged her back into the shadows. What kept her going was the knowledge that she wasn't alone. Friends, colleagues, and mentors rallied around her, offering support in both big and small ways. One colleague surprised her with a care package filled with books and teas, knowing how much she loved reading as an escape. Another sent her tickets to a comedy show, insisting that laughter was the best medicine. Even strangers reached out, sending letters of gratitude or dropping off homemade meals. These acts of kindness reminded her that humanity, despite its flaws, was capable of incredible compassion. As time went on, Agent Carter found solace in giving back. She started mentoring young investigators, sharing her experiences and insights to prepare them for the realities of undercover work. "It's not just about strategy or skill," she told them during one session. "It's about heart. You have to care, not just about solving cases, but about the people affected by them. If you lose sight of that, you risk becoming part of the problem." Her mentees soaked up her advice, inspired by her resilience and dedication. They admired not just her success, but her humility. Despite everything she had achieved, she never acted like she was above anyone else. Instead, she treated everyone with respect, whether they were seasoned agents or rookies fresh out of training. Outside of work, Agent Carter threw herself into advocacy efforts, partnering with organizations focused on homelessness, criminal justice reform, and community empowerment. She spoke at schools, churches, and town halls, urging people to look beyond stereotypes and challenge systemic inequalities. Her message was simple, yet powerful. Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoers. It's about creating a world where everyone has a fair shot at dignity and opportunity. The impact of her advocacy extended beyond speeches and workshops. Inspired by her example, grassroots movements sprang up across the city, tackling issues ranging from affordable housing to police accountability. Murals dedicated to her courage began appearing on walls, depicting her as a symbol of resilience and hope. Local artists painted portraits of her alongside quotes from her speeches, turning her story into art that inspired passers-by to pause and reflect. Despite the recognition, Agent Carter remained grounded. She refused to let fame define her, focusing instead on the values that had guided her throughout her career: integrity, empathy, and perseverance. Whenever someone praised her as a hero, she redirected the conversation. "I'm just one person," she'd say with a modest smile. Real change happens when we come together, as families, as communities, as a society. That's where the true power lies. By the end of the year, the landscape of the city had shifted in noticeable ways. Reforms within the police department were underway, with independent oversight committees established to ensure transparency. Community programs aimed at supporting marginalized groups gained momentum, funded by grants and donations spurred by public demand. While challenges remained, there was a renewed sense of optimism, a belief that progress, though slow, was possible. For Agent Carter, this transformation was proof that her sacrifices had been worth it. The laughter, the ridicule, the months spent living on the fringes of society, it all led to this moment. A moment where people were waking up, questioning assumptions, and working toward a better future. As she stood on a bridge overlooking the city lights one evening, she allowed herself to feel proud, not just of what she had accomplished, but of what others were now striving to achieve. The road ahead would undoubtedly have obstacles, twists, and turns. But for the first time in a long time, Agent Carter felt hopeful. Hopeful that the lessons learned from her mission would endure. Hopeful that the cracks in the system would continue to heal. And hopeful that the next generation would carry the torch, ensuring that justice remained a guiding principle for all. Years had passed since the courtroom revelation that shook the city to its core. The scandal had faded from the headlines, replaced by newer stories and fresher controversies. But the legacy of Agent Carter's mission endured, woven into the fabric of the community in ways that no one could have predicted. Her story wasn't just a tale of justice served, it was a lesson in resilience, courage, and the power of believing in something greater than oneself. Agent Carter eventually retired from active duty, trading her badge for a quieter life dedicated to advocacy and mentorship. Though she stepped away from the front lines, her influence only grew stronger. She became a guiding light for countless individuals who looked up to her, not as a distant hero, but as someone who reminded them of their own potential to create change. To many, she represented proof that even the most invisible among us can shine brightly when given the chance. In neighborhoods once plagued by fear and mistrust, new initiatives began to take root. Community policing programs emerged, designed to rebuild relationships between law enforcement and residents. Officers were required to attend workshops on empathy and cultural sensitivity, learning how to see the people they served not as statistics or problems, but as human beings with hopes, dreams, and struggles. Some officers embraced these changes wholeheartedly while others resisted at first. But over time, even the skeptics began to recognize the value of connection over confrontation. Statues and murals honoring Agent Carter started appearing around the city, each one telling a piece of her story. One mural depicted her sitting on a street corner, her face obscured by shadows, while another showed her standing tall in a courtroom, holding her FBI badge high. Beneath the artwork were quotes from her speeches. "Assumptions can be dangerous," read one. "Justice often comes from the most unexpected places," proclaimed another. These works of art weren't just tributes, they were reminders of the importance of looking beyond appearances and challenging preconceived notions. Schools incorporated her story into their curriculums, teaching students about perseverance, integrity, and the impact of individual actions. Teachers encouraged kids to think critically about fairness and equality, asking questions like, "What would you do if you saw something wrong?" or "How can we make our communities better?" Young minds soaked up these lessons, inspired by the idea that anyone, even someone dismissed as insignificant, could make a difference. For Agent Carter, retirement didn't mean stepping out of the spotlight entirely. She continued to speak at events, write articles, and collaborate with organizations working toward social justice. Her voice remained steady and reassuring, offering wisdom without pretense. She often shared anecdotes from her undercover days, not to glorify herself but to highlight the humanity she encountered along the way. "I met so many incredible people during my time on the streets," she'd say. "People who had every reason to give up but kept fighting for a better life. They taught me more than I ever expected." One of her favorite projects involved mentoring young activists, many of whom were eager to follow in her footsteps. She listened patiently as they poured out their frustrations about the world's injustices, offering advice rooted in experience rather than theory. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she'd tell them. "It's messy, exhausting, and sometimes heartbreaking. But it's also beautiful. Every small victory matters. Every person you help matters. Don't lose sight of that." Her guidance resonated deeply with those who sought her counsel. A teenage girl named Maria, passionate about addressing homelessness, credited Agent Carter with helping her find her purpose. "She told me to start where I am," Maria explained during a school presentation. "So I organized a clothing drive in my neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it made a difference, for the people who received the clothes and for me too. Now I know I can do more." Stories like Maria's warmed Agent Carter's heart, reminding her why she had chosen this path in the first place. Her mission had always been about empowering others, and seeing that ripple effect play out in real time filled her with pride. She knew she couldn't solve every problem or fix every broken system, but she believed in the collective strength of humanity. If enough people cared enough to act, real progress was possible. As the years went by, Agent Carter found joy in simple pleasures, gardening, reading, spending time with loved ones. Yet she never lost sight of the bigger picture. She stayed informed about current events, supporting movements aimed at dismantling systemic inequalities. When protests erupted over police brutality or racial injustice, she joined rallies, marching alongside younger generations determined to carry the torch forward. Her presence at these events served as both inspiration and validation, a reminder that the fight for justice spanned generations. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, she reflected on her journey. The laughter, the mockery, the months spent living on the streets, it all felt like a lifetime ago. And yet it had shaped her in ways she never imagined. Those experiences had taught her the true meaning of resilience, showing her that strength wasn't about avoiding pain, but embracing it and using it to fuel positive change. She thought about the people whose lives had been touched by her work, directly or indirectly. The victims of corruption who finally saw accountability. The young activists inspired to stand up for what they believed in. The officers who had learned to see their communities in a new light. Each of them carried a piece of her legacy, whether they realized it or not. And then there were the lessons she had learned herself, the importance of empathy, the danger of assumptions, the power of persistence. These weren't just principles she preached. They were values she lived by, guiding her through every challenge and triumph. As night fell and the stars began to twinkle above, Agent Carter smiled softly. The battle wasn't over. There would always be fights to fight, injustices to address, and voices to amplify. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet gratitude. She had done what she set out to do. She had proven that even the most invisible among us could shine a light in the darkest corners. And she had shown the world that justice, though sometimes slow, was worth fighting for. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who dared to believe in a better future. And as long as that belief persisted, Agent Carter knew the flame of hope would continue to burn brightly, lighting the way for generations to come.